I got into my car and drove off, leaving Molly behind. I could imagine the confusion and anxiety she must have been feeling, her mind racing with questions about what had just happened. I knew it was hard for her to process, but at that moment, I couldn't stay. The weight of what I now knew was pressing down on me, a burden I wasn't ready to carry any longer. Tonight wasn't about confronting her or making sense of the chaos. It was about taking the first real step toward rebuilding my life, a life where she no longer had a place. As I drove, the cool night air blew through the cracked window, and the hum of the engine became a quiet backdrop to my swirling thoughts. I needed to find some peace, a way to move forward from this nightmare that had consumed me. I wasn't sure how, but I knew I had to try. When I arrived at Gabriel's house, the warm glow of the porch light offered a brief sense of comfort, almost as if the light itself was a safe haven. The smell of freshly baked lasagna wafted through the air, evoking a sense of home and the cozy atmosphere Gabriel and Rose had always managed to create. They greeted me with genuine smiles, their faces lighting up when they saw me step out of the car. I could tell they noticed the tension in my posture, though neither of them mentioned it right away. Gabriel, ever the cheerful one, slapped me on the shoulder in his usual way, offering a warm greeting. "Good to see you, Mason. Come on in. Make yourself at home," he said, his voice warm, but with an undertone of concern that didn't escape me. Rose, always the more observant of the two, stepped forward with a kind smile. She extended her hand and gave me a look that said she understood I wasn't there for casual conversation. "You look like you've had a tough few days," she remarked softly. "Come sit. Let's get you fed." Their kindness was disarming. It almost made me forget, for a moment, what I had just left behind. For a brief second, I could push the thoughts of Molly and the betrayal aside, if only for a little while. During dinner, I tried to keep the conversation light, focusing on work and my interest in joining Gabriel's team. I asked him about his experiences, what it was like to work with him, and his vision for his team's future. I wanted to sound normal, like everything was fine, but as the evening went on, it became harder and harder to keep up the facade. The emotions inside me were too strong to hide. Rose, always perceptive, noticed a shift in my mood. She leaned in, her voice gentle but firm. "Mason, you don't have to share anything you're not ready to, but if you want to talk, we're here for you," she said. Her words, simple but sincere, made my heart ache. I paused for a long moment, the weight of my secret suffocating me. I had been holding it in for days, weeks even, and tonight it all felt like it was about to break free. With a heavy sigh, I placed my fork down, the sound of it against the plate cutting through the otherwise peaceful silence. "It's Molly," I said, my voice almost a whisper, but carrying the weight of a confession. "She's been unfaithful, not just once, but with several people." Gabriel froze mid-bite, his eyes widening in shock. His fork hovered in midair, his expression shifting from concerned disbelief. "Mason, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice soft, filled with sympathy. "That's just awful." Rose reached across the table, gently placing her hand on mine. Her touch was warm and grounding. "I can't imagine how painful this must be for you," she said quietly, her voice full of empathy. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "It's worse than that," I continued, my voice trembling with the weight of the truth. "I have proof, but seeing it, knowing it, it's unbearable. It's with Brad, my boss, and a few of his friends. Even his son." Gabriel's face darkened when I mentioned Brad's name. "Brad? I can't believe he'd do something so low," he muttered, his disbelief evident. Rose leaned forward, her gaze softening further as she took in the full weight of the situation. "Do you have anyone else you can talk to, Mason? A support system outside of us?" she asked gently. I shook my head, feeling the isolation sink deeper. "Not really," I admitted. "That's part of why I came here tonight. I needed to tell someone. I needed to tell someone who might understand what I'm going through." Gabriel's voice was firm with resolve. "You have a place on my team, Mason. We'll get everything set up as soon as you're ready." he said. Offer me a lifeline I hadn't realized I needed. Rose nodded in agreement, her expression sincere. And if you need someone to talk to, whether it's professionally or just to listen, I can help connect you. I'm here for you. Their support felt like a lifeline, something I hadn't known I was craving until that moment. It was clear that, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone in this. As the evening continued, we discussed the logistics of the job transition and how to handle the fallout from my marriage. The weight of it all still hung heavily over me, but there was a small sense of hope growing inside me. I wasn't sure how it would all unfold, but for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could make it through. There was a way forward. When I returned home, the house was quiet. Molly had already gone to bed, and the silence felt oppressive. I stood in the living room for a moment, taking in the space we had shared, the life we had built together. And yet, I wondered how it had all fallen apart so completely. I then walked to the futon, lay down, and stared at the ceiling. The darkness around me reflected the heaviness in my heart. Difficult conversations awaited me, and I knew I had to steel myself for them. The next day, I confronted Molly. I held up the evidence of her betrayal and looked at her with cold, piercing eyes. These aren't the only people, Molly, I said, my voice firm. Brad's not the only one. His son, his friends, everyone. Mason sat tense, staring at Molly across the table, his emotions a storm of anger and disbelief. His voice cracked as he demanded answers, his frustration building with each word. I don't even know. Did they just walk all over you too, or did you willingly throw yourself into this mess? His eyes bore into her as he spoke, desperate for answers. But Molly's face crumpled, and her tears began to fall freely. She couldn't even look at him. I don't know how it got this far, Molly whispered through her sobs, her voice thick with regret. It started with Brad, but then it was like I couldn't stop. I felt trapped, ashamed. I didn't know how to face you. Mason's frustration flared. He stood up, his tone rising sharply as he echoed her words. Trapped, he repeated, his voice sharp. You weren't forced into this, Molly. You had choices at every turn, and every single one of them betrayed me, betrayed us. You let it spiral out of control, and now you want to play the victim. Her sobs were the only sound in response as she clutched her face in her hands, her tears staining her fingers. She spoke softly between sobs. I know I messed up, Mason. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I still love you. The words hit Mason like a slap. His anger flared once more, and he slammed his hand onto the table. The loud sound cut through her sobs. Don't you dare say you love me, he hissed, his voice barely controlled. You don't destroy someone you love. You don't humiliate them, ruin their trust, and shatter their life. Love, you threw that word away the moment you chose Brad over me. She fell silent, her tears still flowing as she sank lower into her chair. For a long time, there was nothing but the sound of her sobs filling the room until Mason finally spoke again. His voice was quieter now, but his words were no less firm. This is over, Molly. There's no fixing this. I'll file for divorce, and there's nothing left to discuss. Her head hung low, her voice barely above a whisper. What do you want me to do? Mason's response was sharp and unfeeling. You will pack your belongings and leave before the paperwork is served. Stay away from me, from my house, and from my life. You chose Brad and his circus. Congratulations. You're free to join them. Molly's shoulders trembled as the heaviness of his words settled deep within her. Her reply was barely audible as she whispered, I'll leave tomorrow. Mason rose, unable to endure another moment of looking at her. His voice was flat as he simply said, Good. The sooner, the better. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone to face the aftermath of her choices. Upstairs, Mason sat at the edge of their bed, staring out the window, trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. His marriage was over, his trust had been shattered, and the woman he thought he'd spend his life with had become a stranger. But as the night wore on, something unexpected began to settle inside him. Relief. It wasn't loud or triumphant, but a quiet, peaceful clarity. Mason had made his decision. He had taken control of his life again, and for the first time in weeks, he felt as though he could breathe. The road ahead was uncertain, but that was okay. He had faced the pain, and now he was ready to rebuild his life on his own terms, without Molly, without Brad, and without the betrayal. In the weeks that followed, as the chaos of heartbreak and betrayal began to settle, Mason slowly began to rebuild. His work at Empire kept him occupied, providing a sense of stability and purpose that he hadn't felt in months. Gabriel, a trusted mentor, offered valuable guidance as Mason navigated his new role within the company. Meanwhile, Rosa's counseling sessions gave him the chance to rediscover parts of himself he thought he had lost forever. He took up fitness, diving into martial arts, and even began reconnecting with old hobbies. Slowly but surely, Mason was finding himself again. One evening, Tracy, a colleague from work, invited him to happy hour. At first, he hesitated. The thought of putting himself out there again felt odd after everything he had been through. But deep down, he knew that staying stuck in the past wasn't the way forward, so he agreed. At the bar later that evening, he found himself laughing with Tracy and the rest of the team. For the first time in what felt like forever, he experienced the joy of good company, of simple fun without tension or deceit. Tracy's warmth and kindness began to draw him in, and their connection felt effortless. She never pried into his past, though Mason knew she was aware of it. Instead, she treated him with kindness and respect, seeing him as Mason, not as the man who had been betrayed. As the days passed, Mason and Tracy spent more time together. What started as casual coffee breaks and team lunches gradually deepened into something more. One evening after work, Tracy stopped by his desk and asked if he wanted to grab dinner. Her invitation was warm and sincere, and for the first time in a long while, Mason felt a flutter of something he hadn't felt in ages. "Yeah, I'd like that," he responded as they walked out of the office together. Mason realized something important. He was finally ready to open himself up to new possibilities. Life had thrown him curveballs, but he was still standing. He was still moving forward. Tracy wasn't a replacement for Molly. She wasn't there to fill the void left behind by his failed marriage. She was simply someone who made him feel hopeful again, and for now, that was enough.